Now, our speaker today, Mrs. Elaine Konigsberg, was born in New York. She grew up in Pennsylvania and graduated from Farrell High School. And she was telling me last night that they have hysteria there like we have Hoosier hysteria. They have the same thing there. If the coach wants a new Cadillac, all he has to do is say, "I'm going to leave," and he gets it. She graduated from the Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh with a degree in chemistry in 1952. She went on into graduate study in chemistry at the University of Pittsburgh, and she states that after 2 years she had succeeded in pushing back her hairline by blowing up the laboratory sink and losing her eyebrows and bangs. She was married while attending school. And then after 2 years of graduate school, she became a research assistant in the tissue culture laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh, then was a graduate teaching assistant in organic chemistry at a private girls' school. Then the family moved to Jacksonville. And it was here in Jacksonville that Mrs. Konigsberg took up painting and drawing. Then in '63, moved back to the New York area, Port Chester. And this is where she joined the Art Students League, and again continuing her painting and beginning her ventures into literature. Since then, they have returned to Jacksonville, and I'm sure you're all going to enjoy her speech. Without further ado, Mrs. Konigsberg.
Thank you. I will say my thank yous with testing this microphone. Am I heard in the back? Yes? All right. Let me begin by reading you part of a letter that I got from a child in White Plains, New York, 10603. Zip code. Dear Mrs. Konigsberg, in our school we are having projects. I chose number 9. Number 9 says to write to a living author. My teacher says you are living. Well, I didn't need that letter to let me know that I was living. I learned that I was living years ago, maybe 16 years ago. That was when I first taught biology at Bartram School. I used to teach my classes that one of the distinctions between living matter and non-living matter was irritability. And I knew I was living then, just as I know I'm living now, because I am very irritable. And if you don't believe me, ask my 3 children. Or ask my mother-in-law. Well, actually, though, I believe that one of the distinctions between writing that lives and writing that does not is whether it has grown out of a living and irritable writer or whether it has not, and mine does. Irritability is the ability to react to stimuli, and I do. Well, I do. Actually, only 2 things make me irritable: people and books. Sometimes a third, the reaction between people and books. But you can avoid a lot of that because you can avoid a lot of cocktail parties where that kind of oil and that kind of heavy water try to mix. It was a latent irritation that made me begin writing for children. That irritation was the bunch of children's books that depicted middle-class America as I was growing up. There were a lot of stories about a typical American child in a typical small town who had a typically kind grandmother and grandfather who lived in the typically picturesque country over the meadows and through the woods. I lived in 3 small towns as I grew up, and I never knew one kid whose grandmother and grandfather came from over the meadows and through the woods. For example, B is for Betsy's grandparents came from there. But I knew several whose grandparents came from the old country. Mine did. I never knew one kid who had a nurse when she was a baby. But B is for Betsy did. I never knew one kid who took a nap after lunch in the 1st grade. B is for Betsy did. Or one kid who couldn't find his way to school after only 3 days and not get lost. But do you remember? B is for Betsy, got lost after 3 weeks. The dust jacket of that book, which I took out of the library only last week, still describes, quote, Betsy and her friends as typical American children. I don't know how they have the nerve. They weren't typical when they were first published, and I ask you if in these days of cross-town busing if they're typical now. I'll tell you what I did know. I knew many kids whose fathers spoke with an accent. Mine did. I knew several families who lived over the store. Mine did. I knew lots of kids raised on goulash and scallopini and kielbasa and who almost never ate steak or cornflakes. I knew a Sabina, a Thelma, 2 Wilmas, and an Achilles, as well as one Dick and one Jane. Those realistic books were to realism as plastic is to plasm. In an off-brand, the taste of canned peas is only reminiscent of fresh ones. Sometimes you need to read the label or the dust jacket to be told what you're consuming. Only recently have I come to realize what I wanted from those books, most especially from those books. I did not want to identify with Betsy and her friends. They were rather dull, really, and there were many perfectly good people from the past and from far away with whom I could identify. There was Joe in Little Women, and there was Caddy in Caddy Woodlawn, and there was Tom in Tom Sawyer. I could identify with those kids in those books because they were written about other times and other places. And I always thought, give me transportation in place and into time, and I knew that I could be those people. But in that fiction, which was supposed to be depicting the middle classes of America, I was not trying to identify with the characters. I was looking for a definition of my identity. I was looking for someone to put me into writing. Me, a girl from a small mill town in Pennsylvania whose last name everyone misspelled and who never had a nursemaid. In the books that promised me a story about typical American children, I was looking for a definition of me. And since the dust jackets of those books promised to come close and never did, I grew to resent them. They were denying my existence. I resented them most because they were so close. Interest-specific aggression, I have read in Conrad Lorenz's book, is always strongest in most closely related species. I held that irritation in abeyance until my children started school. You might say that by that time B is for Betsy had grown on me like a fungus. A fungus creating a niche. Well, the itch flared forth in full living color when my 6-year-old came home from school and asked me to listen to him read Alice and Jerry. Well, now it was Alice and Jerry's mother whom I hated most. She was so patient and understanding, and she was supposed to be typical. So you see, I was again being promised an identity, and Mama Alice Jerry made me look bad and sound bad, especially when I would tell my eager young reader that he wanted to read to me, and I would say to him, "Not now, honey," and he'd say when, and I would say either in 2 years or when Alice and Jerry's mother robs a bank. By the way, that was the same year that I told that boy that when he came home and he asked me how old you have to be to join Boy Scouts, I told him 21. And he said he had 6-year-old classmates who were Boy Scouts, and I said, well, they were only allowed to be because they had pool. You see, their mothers were den mothers. So he found out later that he could not be a Boy Scout unless I became a den mother. But he still talks to me. He says, is my yellow shirt clean, or is breakfast ready? We have nice conversation. Well, since that time, I've refused to reread Little Women because I know that Marmee and I wouldn't get along at all anymore. She was very patient also. Well, after my oldest child's first year in school, we moved away from Alice and Jerryland right into Dick and Jane country. Now my daughter started first grade, and she came home all eager to read to me, and I sat down with her to get acquainted with Dickie and Janie. And she noticed that I was getting pretty impatient, so she said, wait, Mom, here comes the good part. Well, at that point, I think I broke out in hives. I think that Dick and Janie's mother is either simple-minded or else in need of psychiatric care. I suspect that she is a charter member of the Harper Valley PTA. After child number 3 started school, I decided to scratch that itch, and I wanted to write stories about how boys and girls really grow up and how mommies can be nice even though they're nasty. And my kids would never be able to find their identity by reading about Puff and a bitch named Spot in a typical so-called town and with typical so-called parents. But they weren't growing up in a mill town either, I realized. At that time, they were growing up in an apartment, not over a store at all. Their growing up was as different from mine as mine had been from B as for Betsy's. The culture that my children were growing up in was not small town or mill town. It was middle-class suburban. In the lives of a middle-class suburbanite, the need for security is satisfied. Not theirs, the worry of whether they can have a popsicle. Their worry is whether or not they will have to settle for orange instead of banana when they get to the store. When they don't have it, all kids cherish security every bit as much as Janie Larkin did in Blue Willow. Once obtained, however, there is nothing that they take more for granted. Those of you who are guiding and or rearing these children must see this as clearly as I saw it when I first taught this kind of child at Bartram School. But I hope that you have not been as scarred as I had been by the belief in Frances Hodgson's Burnett's Little Princess or Little Lord Fauntleroy, where though they were poor, they had only one maid, Mary, or Dickens's Tiny Tim, that happiness comes with a plum pudding. It doesn't. These kids are testimony that a kid who has always had shoes never seems to be thankful that he has them. These kids are living proof that worries do not end with creature comforts, despite a whole body of children's literature that tries to say otherwise. Once a child, like an adult, is secure, he develops other longings. Longings for stimulation and longings for identity. And that is where I come in with my pen and with my ink pot. That is where my writing has begun. If we can leave out the need for security, we can deal with the other two pressing needs of growing up and of grown-ups. Stimulation can best be defined in terms of its opposite, boredom, and identity in terms of its opposite, anonymity. Stimulation and identity, two basic needs. I think that in a child's formative years, as his world and ours becomes increasingly complex, at the same time that all those complexities increasingly impinge upon us, I believe that the quest for an identity becomes more critical even as it becomes more difficult. As the world becomes larger, we become more of a decimal point in it. More things are more possible to more people. We can no longer be known merely by the name Isaac ben Abraham, Isaac, son of Abraham. We can no longer be known by where we came from as Leonardo da Vinci, Leonardo from the town of Vinci. We can no longer be Goody Cooper, the wife of the cooper, or Mr. Goldsmith, or Tintoretto, the son of the tinter. We can no longer be the son of the town teacher, or the daughter of the town shoemaker, or the town doctor, or the local bum even. There are many of each nowadays. In our mobile society, my children do not even have an enlarged family of cousins and uncles and aunts to help them identify themselves. I recently spoke to a group of about 100 fourth graders in one of the schools near Jacksonville, and I asked them how many of them have moved once since they started school, and about 70 of them raised their hands. How many had moved twice? About 50%. How many, I asked, had moved 3 times since they started school? And 30% of them had moved 3 times. They were in the 4th grade. It is difficult to have an identity of place and a family or of position in a community. In addition, many children have fathers whose work they don't understand at all. Dad goes to an office, and there he supervises people who supervise other people, or he sells something, or he manages others who sell something. Or Dad maybe helps to manufacture some part of some machine, but not the whole. Seldom is there a whole visible product anymore, a shoe or a cured patient. Oh heavens, doctors don't have identifiable patients anymore. They have a Johnson prostate or a Smith uterus. You should excuse the expression. We can't even have an identity name. There are 2 famous Kenneth Clarks. There are 2 Tom Wolfes who are writers, one living and one dead. And there are 2 fictional Tiny Tims, one living and one dead. All of these factors make finding one's identity far more difficult than it ever was. And at the same time, the need to find out who am I, what makes me unique, what is my bag, is even more pressing than it was a generation ago. Doing your own thing then was much less acceptable than it is today. In those days, one was sent to college to be a something, be a teacher, be a chemist, be an engineer, be an artist. One sought an identity and chose to fit himself to it. And often, like the prearranged marriages of 3 generations ago, things worked out surprisingly well. Now the quest is far different. Now the search is finding some career that suits one's particular talents. Both ideas, I think, the idea of the fixed marriage and the current hunt for one's particular career niche, ring of Procrustes, that ancient robber who had a bed and either stretched his guests or chopped them off to fit the bed. Doing your own thing is great, and I approve of it wholeheartedly. How could I, a chemist turned writer, not? And in these days, when one has enough security to permit one to risk it, when one has a society that is much more willing to allow one to do one's own thing, the need to find it, to find one's identity, is far greater than it was a generation ago. Whereas I always felt that I was unique, I had an identity, a Farrell, Pennsylvania identity, a Lobel identity, a minority group identity, and that books denied it by not writing it down, kids nowadays are much more uniform. There is much more middle class. Minority differences are disappearing, and kids are having a harder time finding an identity. One would think that it would be easier for them. Many of them can tell you that they score in the 85th percentile in reading comprehension and that their mechanical ability is below average, but that their creativity quotient is normal. But that's not really defining yourself in meaningful terms. Knowing that is not nearly as important to a kid as knowing how he feels about a banana. It helps some, but I think it helps parents more than it helps kids. At the same time, I'm convinced that good fiction can help a kid find his identity in a way that test scores cannot. Good fiction, I think, talks about real problems. It doesn't have to do it in a solemn manner, and it certainly doesn't have to do it in a hip manner, but it should do it. There is much talk these days about the greater freedom that we have in writing fiction for children. Homosexuality and drugs and premarital pregnancy are included. But I have a sneaking suspicion that these problems have washed down from adult literature or from the movies. They've washed up. And somehow I always feel that movies should wash upwards and not books. Children's literature, you know, has reached the Freudian stage. And if we look at young adult literature to watch for trends as the East Coast watches the weather out of Chicago, we can see that the next thing to come will be the case history novel. That child of the behaviorist psychologists. Somehow, everything comes to hinge on mom and dad and what they did wrong. Let me describe this new source of irritability to you, the juvenile case history novel. The stories are often told in first-person whine. In her book, Tuned Out, Maya Wojciechowska tells of a boy's disillusionment with an adored older brother who returns from college hooked on drugs. There is a tone to the younger boy's journal that is very definitely tuned in, very right, but the denouement falls limp. The older brother explains to the younger that the reason he took to drugs was because once, when he was 5 years old, he overheard his mother and father arguing and saying that if it weren't for the kids, they would get a divorce. He therefore put himself under terrible tension so that he would be so good that they would never consider getting a divorce, and then he went away to school and he copped out on drugs because the tension was so great. A single incident with mom and dad discolored his whole life. The Pigman follows a similar case history whine. The boy and the girl who tell the story in alternating chapters blame hypocritical, non-communicative parents for their own hypocritical, non-communicative ways. But at the very last, when the Pigman dies, the boy John realizes that, quote, there was no one else to blame anymore. Our life would be what we made of it, nothing more, nothing less. That flash of insight comes, thank goodness. It comes suddenly, though, and on the last page. Too bad it comes so lately and so lightly. Richard Bradford's Red Sky at Morning is a book unto itself, however. It is a first-person account of a young boy during the late years of World War II. No case history novel this. Even though the young hero has an irresponsible, vain, spoiled mother and a father who ships the family to New Mexico while he volunteers himself unnecessarily for the U.S. Navy. Mr. Bradford has made room for love in his book, not sentimental, not overbearing love, but love salty enough to give the teenage hero a chance to preserve who he is. We know the identity of that young man when the book is finished, and what is better, so does he. He wears the scars of his upbringing as marks of identification rather than a seed of hopelessness. But then Mr. Bradford wrote his book for adults, and teenagers simply adopted it. Mr. Salinger did that too, and Miss Harper Lee and John Knowles made a separate piece, and when Hannah Green wrote her book for adults, she never promised teenagers a rose garden, but she delivered one. These people didn't write, these people wrote for themselves, not for 1940s movies, transferred to books. They didn't listen to Mr. Rod McEwen either. It was Mr. Rod McEwen who recently said in my local paper in Jacksonville, Florida, and I quote, "Today you can be anything, and youngsters will accept you if you relate to things they're interested in." Now, isn't that a contradiction? Saying that you can be anything, but if you're an adult, be what the kids want you to be? That's one way of becoming popular. Maybe that's Mr. Zindell's way. Let me read you an excerpt from another one of his books, My Darling, My Hamburger, page 60. Liz, one of the heroines, is writing to her boyfriend Sean. Listen. We had wonderful nights at the beach, and I'm not saying we didn't. I just think we started going too far. We went further and further on each date, and you expected to always get as far each time, and if I stopped you, you'd say I was being mean. Did you think I wanted to stop? I want to have sex with you. I've often thought what it would be like. You think it's been so easy for me? We don't have any fun now when we go out. Well, one night Liz gets mad at her mother. You knew that would do it. And then Liz goes all the way, as we used to say. And Liz gets pregnant, as we used to say. And Liz gets an abortion, and Liz hemorrhages. But Liz doesn't die because children's books should end on a note of hope. There was that kind of writing when I was growing up, and I read lots of it, but it was never sanctioned by any society of the Friends of the Library. Actually, it was much more fun. It was bad writing, and it was forbidden, and it was found in true confessions. And to this day, I say I want my pornography pure. I don't want any redeeming social virtue. Oh, I say, damn it, I waited a long time to be grown up. And I am not going to do, as Mr. McEwen says, and do their thing so they can relate to me. I shall write what I am interested in and what I think they should be interested in, and then I put it out for adoption. I choose to write about children's needs as I see them and not as I think they are. As I see it, when you are writing for children, you can write about the most basic needs that people have, because the needs are not yet an intricate web of deceits and self-deceits and games that people play. And when you are writing about secure middle-class children, you can write about the need for identity and the need for stimulation. And it can be wrapped in a storyline that is historical, or it can be wrapped in a storyline that is current. And it doesn't have to be Freudian or be behaviorist or true confessional in an effort to be up to date. They aren't new anyway. After I got out of True Confessions, I saw lots of those movies where we came to understand through a series of flashbacks that Virginia Mayo would never again wear a blue blouse because her mother wore a blue blouse when she brought her rival sibling home from the hospital. Come on now. My own husband, who is a psychologist, says there comes a time in every person's life when he must stop blaming his lifestyle on rotten toilet training. I think that a child is pretty formative until the age of about 11 or 12, and I have special feelings about that age. All the years until sometime around the 6th grade, a child is in the process of finding out who he is. He should be allowed to have the time and the aloneness necessary to find this out. I talk about that need and about the B'nai Bagels, where the last outpost of Mark Setzer's free time is not only organized, but also invaded. Mark's mother, Bessie, becomes the manager of his Little League team, and his brother becomes his coach. In the 2 years that a child stands on the threshold of his teens, in his 11s and his 12s, he begins to feel the pull of his peers. And if he has not established what he is for himself, he may ride with the pack before he is ready. And what he is can become so fragmented that he can't pull it all together again. 2 of my books deal with this time, this tug-of-war time between a child's defining himself in terms of his bones and his own personal aches, and his need for losing that identity for the sake of being in, of belonging. One of those books is called From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Vasily Frankweiler. In this book, Claudia, aged 12, decides to run away from home, partly because she feels she has to teach her parents a lesson in Claudia appreciation, but mostly because, and she does not totally realize, she is tired of being straight-A Claudia Kincaid. She wants some kind of adventure, some kind of stimulation, preferably a neat, tidy, washed and ironed adventure. Claudia knows herself well enough to know that she could never pull off the old-fashioned kind of running away. She knows herself well enough to know that she doesn't like discomfort, and so that's why she decided upon the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Claudia finds, however, that her adventure is not quite satisfying. She keeps telling Jamie, her brother, that she wants to come back different. Claudia, after all, wants some stimulation, but mostly she wants an identity, one that isn't the exact pattern of every other comfortable 12-year-old in Greenwich, Connecticut, where she lives. Mrs. Frankweiler helps Claudia discover that the important thing is being different on the inside where it counts. Anyone at peace with whom he is can do what everyone else in the whole world is doing, but have it be something different. My newest book, George, is the converse of this problem. The book tells about Benjamin Dickinson Carr, a 12-year-old who is very gifted in science and who has a little man living inside of him. The little man is George. Ben is attracted to William Hazlitt, a student who is a senior and who chooses to abuse the freedom given him in the chemistry lab in his progressive, non-graded school. William has a plan for manufacturing LSD and selling it. Ben and his George quarrel over William. Ben has a hard time deciding whether to go the way of William and the crowd or whether to go the way of George, his identity. With help and with humor, he goes the way of George. There are some grown-ups who are puzzled by George. Just this week, I read an article about Rollo May, and he speaks about George. Even if he didn't know he was speaking about him, he was. He speaks of a daimon, D-A-I-M-O-N, and he says, quote, "It's a voice that speaks to us, not conscience, you understand. The daimonic existed prior to the idea of good and evil. The daimonic unites us with our deepest possibilities." Rollo May and children have no trouble understanding George, and those of us who have never let our own Georges die, I think, have never smothered him in sophistication, I think we all understand George too. I hope that my books sound current. I hope that they read like today, and that they speak for now. But I believe that they are also of yesterday, and I would like to think that they will be of tomorrow too. And if they are, it's because they speak basically to children about basic needs, stimulation, and identity. From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Vasily Frankweiler is not about running away as much as it is about finding yourself. And George is not about drugs as much as it is about making peace with yourself. Ben's thing, after all, is George. And my thing, I guess, is not just irritability. My thing, I guess, is the gap between my love for some things as they really are and my irritation with how they are shown in books. My thing is irritability, but tempered, I hope, always with love. And my thing, too, I guess, is trying to bridge that gap between things as they really are and things as they are shown in books. And to make that bridge humorous, yes, and honest, yes, just as honest as I possibly can. Thank you.